going nuclear, going small. So obviously that has two things, right? Going nuclear, and what's this small thing? I think we're about to find out. I have been interested in nuclear power for a long time. In fact, when I was in high school, I applied for a scholarship to go into the Navy nuclear program and go to Caltech, but my Navy recruiter got my paperwork in a day late. And so I ended up becoming an Army officer, wah, wah. And yeah, I maybe I'm a little too tall. I used to be 6'5½", and then I spent a lot of time in tanks, and now I'm 6'4½". I can't imagine the amount of concussions I might have gotten had I served on board a Navy nuclear vessel and banged my head against the bulk, the hatches. What do you call those things in the Navy? Bulkheads. Yeah, bulkheads, right? We don't have bulkheads in a tank. We just have hatches, and nothing is very forgiving. None of it is covered with rubber or anything like that. You just bleed. Anyway, so enough of that. And then when I was in the legislature in California, for which I'm still paying penance by having been here in Texas now for some 13 years, they passed this really stupid thing called like the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. Schwarzenegger signed it into law. And it had this very aggressive agenda to essentially decarbonize California's economy. And I'm looking at this thing saying they can't do this unless they drop the state's longstanding ban on building new nuclear power plants. And so I introduced legislation to try to do that, to force the issue, to try to force the conversation and say, okay, your math does not add up. So let's get logical here, and logic in California. Okay, yeah, right. And of course that didn't go anywhere. And now California has the second highest electricity costs in the country. The only state that's higher is Hawaii, and they power their grid. They actually don't have a grid, but they power their electricity with diesel generators and a little bit of solar. So we now have this interesting situation where, because of artificial intelligence, because of data centers, because Texas is so popular as a place to move to, that we have soaring energy demands in the state of Texas. And it's not going to be met with wind and solar like out in California, which is the current pathway. And so there has to be an alternative plan. We have to have some way of getting all this power to power future Texas jobs. And so joining me today, I'm really excited to have what I think is a premium panel here. I've got Zabrina Johal, and she is the Senior Director of Strategic Development at General Atomics. Those are the guys that make some of the drones that our terrorist friends don't much like. I've been out there a few times back when I was in the legislature because they have a nuclear fusion experimental tokamak out there in La Jolla. And it takes an enormous amount of power to power the shots that they do. And it's a pretty cool facility. So she's been there, I think you said, for 18 years, 19 years now, as the Senior Director of Strategic Development at General Atomics. She began her career as a nuclear engineering officer in the U.S. Navy, leading the Tomahawk strike operations during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and making history as the first female officer on the USS Paul Hamilton. All right. She graduated from Santa Clara University with a degree in physics and chemistry. So, not like me with my liberal arts degree. Recruited into the U.S. Navy's nuclear power program, holds master's degrees from Old Dominion University and the University of San Diego, and serves on multiple industry and academic boards. In addition, there's more. We have Jack Spencer, who is the Senior Research Fellow, Energy and Environment Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where my old boss works now. So, Jack, I guess your boss is my old boss, so good luck with that. Jack is the author of Nuclear Revolution, Powering the Next Generation. I think you may have brought a book or two, Jack. Imagine that.
And it's available on Amazon.com.
There you go, and it's available. But he assured me there would be no shilling, no commercialization of this panel. It was only published last year. He specializes in domestic and international nuclear energy policy. He's testified before Congress on numerous occasions, including on nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear waste management, and the role of nuclear energy in America's energy mix. He served as a member of the 2016 Department of Energy landing team. That means he helped President Trump in his first term flesh out the Department of Energy staff. He also served as a senior legislative analyst for Babcock and Wilcox, where he provided research, analysis, communication strategy, and outreach for commercial nuclear power and Navy nuclear programs. So we've got some people up here who are very, very smart. And so let's start off right away. Tell me, how much power does nuclear power provide the U.S. grid, and how much did it provide, let's say, 20 years ago, thereabouts, either person?
20% and 20%. Actually, 18.9% now, and it's been about 20% since the mid-90s, I'd say.
But I will add that it's 20%, although 50% of clean
There you go.
electricity.
Right.
So
Well,
while it's only 20%, it's 50% of clean electricity.
and how much
to the
of
grid.
clean dispatchable is it?
100%.
So you don't
I already
consider
gotta
large
pick a fight
hydro
here.
is a clean dispatchable? Say again.
I already got to pick a fight here.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Oh, good. Bring it
Clean,
on.
depending on how you define clean, some of us would call that good old-fashioned coal that scrubbed all the particulates out of the air. That's clean as well. So it's
a little marketing going on here.
50% of the CO2-free energy.
There you go.
If
The
that is how
further
one defines
definition.
clean.
Okay.
I would say that's the one thing that's wrong with nuclear. It doesn't emit enough carbon dioxide.
So yeah, right. So let me ask though, if it's still the same today as it was, the percentage-wise, as it was, let's say, 20 years ago, how did that happen given, for example, the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear generating station in the great state of California?
Yeah, that was a big, so welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I am a California transplant Montana native, so I love being in Texas. So while I'm a transplant of California, I agree with the way you open the discussion because I do not agree with their policy decisions. So San Onofre was a nuclear plant in the state that got shut down prematurely in 2012, and the state lost 30% of its clean electricity and 1,000 well-paid jobs.
Yeah.
And the state today imports more electricity than any other state in the nation. And as you mentioned, it's second highest in electricity pricing only to the island state of Hawaii. And if you look at the pricing projections, the slope of that curve is terrifying because it's straight up. And the reason why is because they want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, but the plan to get there is to quadruple solar and wind.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So is one of the reasons, though, why the share of nuclear power has stayed relatively constant is they've managed to get more electrons
power
out of each.
uprates.
Yeah. So isn't that interesting? So the plants that we do have are producing even more power than they ever have before. Is that it?
Power uprates, then Watts Bar, which was begun in the 1970s, came online.
Ah, there you go.
Then we had the two
All right.
Vogel plants. And there are a number of reactors who will engage in further power uprates as we move forward.
So the theme of this panel is, of course, going nuclear, going small. And the power plants that we've generally have, excluding the military ones, which you're very personally familiar with, generally speaking, in the U.S., we've constructed nuclear power reactors that output between, 750 megawatts to 1.2 gigawatts or so, somewhere in that range. So they're big, right? What is the attraction right now? What is all this buzz and interest with small modular nuclear reactors? How do those change the equation at all, either politically or economically? What's going on with the interest in this smaller reactor technology?
So there are trade-offs with any decision-making behind the size of the energy technologies that we commercialize. And the trade-off between the small and the large is with these large, say 1 gigawatt scale reactors, it's a very high construction cost up front or sticker price. And back in the 2000 time frame, when they started looking at how do we start building more nuclear. We know we want more nuclear, yet companies can't project their entire balance sheet to build one plant. Let's try going small. So while the sticker price, the construction cost up front is lower, and you can potentially put them together like Legos, so you could build another one next to it and have similar services required for them. If you look at the overall price of electricity for the plant, it's an economies of scale decision. So you're getting less output for a higher price, yet the sticker price is lower. So it depends on how you want to economize your product that you would be building.
Can I add something? There's another thing, though, about small modular or advanced nuclear that is attractive right now, which is that you have firms, whether they're tech firms or other things in the petrochemical industry, who need power, need a lot of power. And one of the outcomes of the last 4 years, I would say even beyond that, but it really came to fruition over the last 4 years, is the degradation of the grid. And so what these firms understand is they need a power source. They can't necessarily depend on the grid. And they're willing to pay this premium. It's the ability for small modular and advanced nuclear. It's to be applied in many different ways. It's the versatility of those reactors that make them attractive. Now, the economics question is one that still, I think, is yet to be resolved ultimately, and that really will be what drives it forward.
So in the big versus small argument and the upfront costs, isn't a huge part of that something, Jack, that you've specialized in, which is the regulatory hurdles that put a huge amount of that capital at risk? You can begin the process of planning and building a nuclear power plant, and then as you go through the dozens of federal and state permission processes, you're also going to be sued 20 times by the various left-wing environmental groups. And so then it takes 30, 40 years to complete a plant before you start putting electrons into the grid, and the amount of upfront costs that you've sunk into that is just devastating.
Well, the regulatory burden is huge. It's one additional layer, but there are other things as well. But yeah, absolutely. And if there's this underlying assumption out there that nuclear is inherently expensive. It's not. The United States built large commercial reactors for about half the price, less than half the price that we built them today. The first 30 reactors that were built in this country, big reactors, most of them, maintained cost or reduced cost. It wasn't until NEPA was passed, and then, not to get, probably some people in the audience know this term, and we can talk more about it, something called the linear no threshold model, which is the regulatory basis on which low dose radiation is regulated. Those things began creating a ratcheting up of the regulatory burden,
Right.
and you had this huge spike in the cost of nuclear. Then you have 3 Mile Island and another huge spike. And that has become the policy baseline
Right.
of where we exist today. And that's why Vogtle cost, $33 billion,
Right.
and the SMR companies, every time they start to get some SMR companies, as they begin to get momentum, it often comes to a quick halt because all of a sudden it costs more than what anyone
Right.
thought it was going to.
Yeah, I'll just add something about the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's how all the nuclear plants have to come to the grid. When you start talking about small modular reactors, there's a lot of benefit in the different attributes that they have. So for example, a specific kind of small modular reactor, a high temperature gas reactor that we were trying to economize from General Atomics, could take the spent fuel from a LWR reactor, the commercial reactors today, and use it as its fuel because it was a different type of reactor. But the challenge is that the NRC needs expertise and people and the ability to be able to regulate a new type of reactor, and they don't have that today. And if you look at the only small modular reactor that has received a design certification from the NRC is NuScale. They spent over $1 billion in nuclear regulatory fees just to get a design certification.
And a lot of that was taxpayer dollars. So you spent a ton of money on that
To
process.
So-
pay government lawyers?
To pay the NRC,
the-
oh.
Lawyers
Yeah.
and bureaucrats.
So when we now start looking at, and that was a water-cooled reactor, but smaller, essentially, than what we have in the fleet today. if you start talking about gas reactors and molten salt reactors, you can imagine what a regulatory burden is going to be to bring these to market.
And here's, not to keep cutting you off, but here's what's sad about the whole
I
thing.
wasn't saying anything.
Here's, I figure you had a question lined up, but here's this. We've done this before. That's the thing. The United States has done this before. GA is not the first person to build a high temperature gas cooled reactor. We have built, American firms have built and commercialized high temperature gas cooled reactors, and they've had some semblance of success with them. But the whole system funnels everything towards this one technology, and they overregulate. It's impossible to do anything in an economical way. And at the end of the day, if this thing's not economical, it's not going to be successful. It will ultimately fail. So that's why we are hearing about thinking big. We need to think big about nuclear. And I'm not talking about thinking big about big nuclear plants. We need to question why we're doing this. You know how many people have died as a result of a radioactive release in the United States? Zero. As many people died from the first 10 reactors that have died from the last 10 reactors, which is the same as died every one in between, yet we regulate so much more. What the hell are they thinking? Like, let's do it different.
They regulate because they can. So what is it that you said earlier? Explain to the audience, what is the linear no threshold? What's this thing again?
The linear no threshold model. God, now
What
I'm getting
is
way
that?
out above my skis.
No, this is important because this is how they get the camel's nose in the tent, right? So, I mean, part of the challenge is, I mean, any of you have like granite countertops at your house, right? How many of you have worked in a granite building, right? How many of you have vacationed or lived above, let's say, 6,000 feet, right? I grew up in a ski resort in California, so I was getting all kinds of extra radiation. So tell us about what that explains a lot. Thanks for laughing. I heard that. So tell us what that's all about.
The linear no threshold model says that any exposure at all to low dose radiation increases your risk of cancer. That is not true. No one ever thought it was true. Even in the 60s, when they were first developing this science, they knew it wasn't true. Yet the narrative took place, and by 1975, I believe it is the year, you could find out in this book. I'm just saying as a matter of education. It became the legal basis on which regulation for nuclear power was established.
Right.
So it is the regulatory basis for nuclear power is this idea that any exposure, any low dose radiation increases your risk of cancer. That's not true. So that drives a lot of the costs. It drives most of the costs. The amount of space that's around the power plant, the amount of materials that go into the power plant. That's not to say we shouldn't protect against radiation exposure. We should. But the protection should be consistent with the risk. And so one of the things that could truly change the paradigm around nuclear power, that could get us back to where we should be, is getting rid of the linear no threshold model as the basis of nuclear regulation.
So, Zabrina, looking at the small reactors that obviously, I think every single reactor used by the military could count as a small reactor. Of course, they have a much more highly enriched blend of uranium that they're using in those reactors, which is why they can be so small. So given some of the concerns about grid resiliency, given the costs associated with long-distance power transmission, as we're seeing here in Texas, with bringing power in from great distances from West Texas to where it's needed in central and the eastern part of the state, what are some of the different types of small modular reactor designs? Are there different types? And how far advanced are they down kind of the regulatory approval path? Are any of us going to see any of these things before we retire or pass on, expire? Yes,
very, very debatable, unfortunately. Unless we reform our regulatory process, and I heard the new Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, talking about this the other day, that we absolutely need to reform our regulatory process or it's going to be very, very hard. So back in the 2007 era, there were about 70 different small modular reactor designs and companies trying to commercialize these technologies. Today, that's downsized quite considerably. One of the companies that's primarily in the game is TerraPower, whose owner is Bill Gates. So you can imagine why they're still around. It was a challenge with TerraPower because they needed to qualify their fuel. So when you have a new type of fuel for a new reactor design, you actually have to see how it ages over lifetime. So you have to have a way of qualifying it. And with some of these reactors, the neutrons are faster, have more energy than the reactors that we have already commercialized. So where do you go to qualify? At that time, TerraPower was going to go to China to qualify their fuel. Well, then there was a trade war, and he lost, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars. I think Bill Gates is about the only one that can afford that kind of a loss and still continue the project. And today, he's now building a reactor in my neighboring state of Montana, Wyoming, called the Natrium reactor. And they do have a construction permit, and he's making progress. But all of these other types of reactor designs, and there are a lot. You have molten salt cooled, you have gas reactor, you have water cooled, you have high pressurized, low pressurized, you have all these different types of reactor designs. You have to have the financial backing to get it to market, and there aren't many places to do that. If you look around the world, it isn't private companies that are bringing these reactors to market. It's governments. The Chinese have a reactor, Koreans have a reactor. They're all government-backed because of the regulatory pressure, the financial uncertainty, and some of the technical risks to get there. Within the U.S., we have a different model. We have a free market-ish type model where we're looking at private developers and companies. But I'll tell you, we are losing the race. We are losing it. And I think the only shining point in this narrative is that the Department of Defense has decided to look at, and they're not, so when you talk about a small modular reactor, it's 300 megawatts or less. When you talk about a micro reactor, now we're talking about 20 megawatts or less. And the Department of Defense is looking at 20 megawatts or less in a Pele program, P-E-L-E. And I think that that is one potential way of getting some of these, even though it's 20 megawatts or less, they're making significant progress, and they can, in certain areas, bypass the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Isn't it true that if a reactor is entirely on a Defense Department-owned land, isn't all the approving authority, in fact, with the Department of Defense and not with the other agencies? Isn't that the case?
Yes, I think there is some input from the Department of Energy, but primarily with the DoD.
But then that power can never be sold, I don't think. The NRC needs to get involved if it's ever going to be commercially distributed, I think, but don't quote me on that. But I think
well, those things, of course, can always be changed, right?
Yeah, yes. But I would argue if our approach to beating the Russians and Chinese in the United States is to just build a couple of reactors on army bases, that doesn't make us win. What makes us win is what has always made the United States win, which is innovation, ingenuity, free enterprise, competition. That's
right.
How we win. And this idea, I'm not suggesting either.
Well, what I'm suggesting though is if you get a few different designs, you can get some reps in on the military base that could potentially drive down, amortize out your R&D costs and make it more
I agree with that.
More able to replicate commercially, right?
I disagree with it. I don't think that works in the long term. I think that gives one selected firm who wins that contract.
I said multiple.
Okay, I don't think that will happen. I think
Okay.
the Department of Energy's history is littered with very similar programs. Clinch River, MOX. There's lots of them that have even General Atomics, a company that I love, by the way, has a number of examples that kind of fall in ish to that category. GA has. I don't want to talk. GA can talk about GA itself. I want to talk about GA.
Talk about your book.
There have been. Let me put it. There have been lots of companies who have taken lots of taxpayer money to try to fix this issue. My point is, let's fix the underlying problems that give rise to the issue to begin with. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, but I'm going to jump in because in the 1950s, the thought of putting a nuclear reactor on a submerged submarine with a crew was unbelievable. And the only way nuclear power was ever commercialized in the first place, it was the United States that did it. And they did it through Admiral Hyman Rickover in the Navy. And they did it through 2 designs. They had 2 designs, and they eventually went with one, with companies in the United States. And then the rest of the world followed suit. It never would have happened if it wasn't a government program, if it wasn't Department of Defense, and if it wasn't somebody like Hyman Rickover that actually made it happen.
I agree.
And he commercialized the first reactor after that.
Totally agree. It's not the 1950s. We have literally 70 years of successful operations at this point. The nuclear industry has every ability to move this forward. I'm not criticizing the industry. I'm criticizing the government who has created a dependency model for too many firms. That's all I'm saying. So I'm saying if China and Russia, if winning that is part of this calculation, the United States has a formula. It's based on free enterprise. We have a history. Yes, it's true that and something important on this whole Rickover story, no one had ever built a nuclear submarine before. He did it in 4 years. So this idea that we, after having built 125 of these things, can't do it in 5 years again is not true. We could. The first commercial nuclear power plant built in Shippingport, built in under 5 years. The first nuclear plant built in Idaho, built in under 2 years. So don't tell me we need to build a bunch of them on a nuclear or on an army base to figure out how to do it. We have done it. We need to fix the underlying problems. And it's an important part of the story. Yes, Rickover pushed it initially, but there was also a sense that the commercial sector had to bring it forward. And then that initial round of moving out of the labs was very private sector driven. That's not to say Rickover didn't have influence, he did. But you had consortiums being built. You had a lot of things happening that the private sector was pulling it forward.
Yeah, I mean, some of what I'm concerned about, though, is pursuing multiple tracks at the same time. And if what we need to do to begin to get the public used to the idea of nuclear power again, and given the increasing vulnerability of our grids, not only to external attack from hostile entities like China or Russia or even a natural event, having a greater familiarity with nuclear power by having it actually on a terrestrial base rather than on a aircraft carrier or on a submarine, which you rarely see because it's usually underwater or prowling around out in the oceans, I think is an important step in kind of reintroducing this industry to the American public. And so that's one of the reasons, because these regulatory hurdles I don't think are going to be broken down very readily.
And I'll add one thing to that, because we've talked a lot about regulation, but we've lost our supply chain in the United States. And the only way to get it back is to have orders on the books to be able to build things. And that was one of the big challenges with Plant Vogtle that was just built in the Southeast. We need to get our supply chain back. And we also need to secure our fuel source. We were getting a lot of the downblended uranium that was enriched in Russia during the war imported into the United States. And we're now not doing that anymore. So we have this fledgling project to try to get enrichment capabilities in the United States, but it's at a pilot scale right now with Centrus, and we need to improve that greatly as well.
Right.
So I agree with what you're saying, but we do have nuclear power plants all over the country. There are a lot of nuclear plants around the country. We don't need, the American public is far more familiar and supportive of nuclear power because of nuclear power plants being all over the country. And I think you're recognizing, at least if one's position is that we need to put them on army bases to familiarize the public. I don't think that does it. I think that we have it. We need to build on that momentum that we already have. And the whole fuel debacle is all because of dumb government policy.
Sir, you are
Agreed.
redundant.
I will be redundant again, because what government is trying to do is to fix its dumb government policy with more dumb government policy. Let's try good policy for once. And this idea, the idea of the orders, I get it, I understand that. But here's what happened in 2000. One of the things that happened in 2009 during the previous nuclear renaissance. You had initial private sector interest in nuclear power. And here comes government and special interests saying, we want to push it forward. And they put forth the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that put forth a bunch of subsidies for nuclear power. That then gave the mirage of a market in the future that wasn't real. But all this investment came in. You had modular facilities being built in Louisiana and Virginia. You had enrichment facilities going to be built in Idaho. All over the country, you had all this stuff, but it wasn't being pursued because of market realities. It was being pursued because of this mirage that was driven by subsidies. And we're seeing the same thing happen again, and we're going to miss this opportunity because here comes government. We're going to push it from the top down, and you're going to get the investment. Everyone's going to say, look at all the investment. And then because it wasn't real, it's going to crash. To make it real, you fix the underlying problems, and then let nuclear succeed or fail on its own. And I think that given the past, the experience, it'll succeed.
So let's talk about a couple of those hurdles, right? In one case, you have things like the ongoing fairly large subsidies, mostly from the federal government, to wind and solar, without an understanding or appreciation for the fact that it's non-dispatchable electricity and requires very costly backups, right? Which nuclear power obviously doesn't require. So you have that issue from an economic standpoint. You also have a companion issue which hasn't been mentioned yet, which is a combination of poor understanding of science in our educational system, this fear of radiation as this unknown. You hear stories, and of course, communist China is all too happy to amplify them, about, for example, some of the waste being generated from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. I remember there was a small earthquake in a 55-gallon drum of low-level nuclear waste with some water in it spilled and went into the ocean, and they talked about how much radiation was in it in the unit of becquerels. And I looked at it and I thought, oh my gosh, that sounds like a lot of radiation. And I started to run some numbers, and it was the equivalent of throwing 3 adult American men into the water because your body's radioactive, right? And so it was the same amount of radiation as taking 3 guys and throwing them into Tokyo Bay or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to get Godzilla, coming out of the water because of this, But they made it as a big deal in the news because nobody knows what 35,000 becquerels or whatever the unit was that was used, right? Mm. And so part of the challenge is our enemies, right? The Chinese Communist Party and the Russian Federation want to play upon Americans' fears, right, to help shut down a nuclear program. So is that not a factor?
So speaking of Fukushima, 20,000 people died. It was a big tragedy. They all died from the tsunami. 0 died from the reactor. People don't understand that. More people die from solar energy, falling off roofs, installing solar plants in the United States, than they do from nuclear energy. So there's a huge misconception. My children are in elementary school, and they're learning all about wind and solar. And I went and talked to the teacher, and I said, where's nuclear? She says, nobody understands it to teach it. That's a big travesty. We need to fix the educational system, number one. So I'm glad you said that. Number 2, we are seeing eye to eye. I appreciate this. Thank you. It's a big risk because...
This is called a joint operation, I guess,
we're
isn't
working
it?
against it.
I'd have it no other way.
So when you think about Russia and China's nuclear programs, they are very vibrant. And when Russia sells a reactor to a developing nation, which is their goal, it then has that nation relying on them for almost 90 years because they build it, and then they operate it, and then they decommission it. And oh, by the way, when Russia sells them their fuel, they take it back and resell it. So they're dependent on them for their energy security, which we know means national security. And when the United States isn't in the game, then that's what we're doing, is we're ceding all of that political capital, all of that will, to our adversaries.
Wow.
We are all in this. I agree with all of that. We need to. I mean, that we don't have a functioning nuclear waste management system is, I mean, literally illegal. I mean, the courts have decided it's illegal. Of course, you know who screwed that up?
Harry Reid.
No.
No? I thought we
The
had...
Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982, the politicians and bureaucrats screwed it up.
But again, I just want to challenge you on that, because
Yes.
if we were to take all of the nuclear waste from the commercial nuclear reactors in the United
Oh, it's
States
so
from
big.
the beginning that it started
It's
till
so
today,
gigantic.
it spans one football field 30 feet high.
Yeah.
That's the problem, that California has a moratorium on building new nuclear plants because they have this perceived issue with waste.
And so now
No, I
where do
agree
they
with
store
that.
it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a problem. It's a political problem, and we're not able to offer in international competitions the fuel to waste.
So
thing.
because of the opposition, though, to a permanent storage facility in Nevada, where you had this perfect geological formation to store it, which, by the way, as technology advances and time goes on, that material will probably become very valuable in the future to future generations. So without a permanent storage facility, where's all this stuff being stored now?
Safely on site.
Yeah.
Here's an example of private sector innovation. When the government didn't take the waste, as they were legally obliged to, in 1998, industry developed a dry cask storage system. So you take the used fuel out of the pools where it is, it cools down significantly, and you put it in a concrete and steel cask, and it sits on site, and you can go up and touch it or kiss it, and you're fine. Like, it's fine.
Well, no, by the way, the military has had a vibrant program where do you think they're putting their waste? It's not an issue. It's not a challenge. This is a perceived challenge
Right.
that we're essentially making our grids less reliable and reducing our national security for perceived issues that aren't real.
But here's, yeah. I think we should. Well, I saw people starting to clap, and then I started talking. I was going to interrupt the clapping, and I didn't want to do that. But there is a real issue here, and when I said the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, that was a watershed decision, because what that did was took the responsibility out of the private sector's hands and put it in government's hands. And that misalignment of responsibility and incentives is at the heart of the problem, because very few politicians want to take what they perceive as political upside risk for fixing this problem that they can just kick the can down the road. And so that's why it's become this political football. What you see around the world, the common thread for every functioning system for managing nuclear waste, including the one in the Defense Department, is the waste producer is responsible for waste management. Anywhere you look, whether it's France, which is a socialist system, whether it's Finland, which is, and Sweden, which is more of a private sector system, anywhere where it's a functioning system, the waste producers in charge of waste management. We should learn from that and move forward from this antiquated, broken system that has literally decades of failure and put it back in the private sector. I think that's one of the keys, and it drives innovation, because as soon as the producer is responsible for management, that creates a whole new market for new reactor technologies, because now once you're responsible for it, you want a waste stream that's easier to manage, or you might, we heard about all these advanced reactors earlier, a lot of those will use that waste. And it puts an actual price on geologic storage. So rather than the Department of Energy or the federal government going to Nevada and saying, we're going to pay you X amount of dollars and you're going to take the waste, Nevada can say, we'll take your waste, but it's going to cost X amount of dollars. That's the way an actual market works.
So let's back up just a little bit, though, because as the former California politician who's still paying for his sins, what I would ask you to consider is that you've been speaking an awful lot about logic. And as a former California politician, of course, this is causing a migraine because I can't process logic. And so are either one of you interested in commenting on the fact that there may in fact be a class of people who look at this issue and who do not want abundant, clean, reliable nuclear energy because it reduces their excuse to control your life.
Yes.
Deep.
So yes to that. I mean, this isn't the global warming discussion, I know, but let's be honest. The global warming discussion is all about controlling everything we do. If it wasn't, then they wouldn't be telling us what kind of energy to produce and insisting that we produce the most expensive, least affordable, or least reliable kind. They would just put a cap on carbon and say, go do your thing. So we know that that's all about control. But with nuclear, it's not just that. Though there is broad public support, I would say that that support is rather thin. If there was another accident, I think you see that support go down, which is a big problem, even though I can't even imagine a worse accident than Fukushima. And well, Chernobyl's a different ball of wax. And so we can talk about that. But anyway, the point is that there are other interests who don't want to see nuclear be successful as well, and they've been around for a long time. So there are lots of groups out there who don't want to see nuclear go forward, and it's all of their arguments that have layered the regulatory thing that we've been talking about over decades, and we need to break that down.
Right. So what's the path? What's the path then if you were to project forward? Okay, so here we have. Can you believe it? It's been 30 days since President Trump has taken office. Is that true? Right. Basically, a month ago today. Right. It seems like a decade, but it's been 30 days, and so you have this administration moving very quickly. We have a brilliant new Secretary of Energy with Chris Wright, who, by the way, is a friend of this foundation, and kind of project forward 4 years from now. Do we have in America 4 years from now any new operational small nuclear reactors?
That's a gamble I don't know if I'm willing to take. I hope that we can start making changes within the regulatory process, but we also need to build the supply chain. And there are ways we can do it where we're smart about how we do it. Some of that has to do with those companies or those countries that know how to make certain things, reaching out to them, establishing collaboration, transferring intellectual property over to the United States to reinvigorate our supply chains. But it's not going to be easy, and I don't know if we're going to get there in 4 years.
This international piece of it is extraordinarily important. I totally agree with that. We're not going to have a new SMR in 4 years. I think there could be some under construction or about to get under construction, but that's the less interesting outcome to me. Have we made fundamental change to the system that doesn't, one or two SMRs, they're fun, but they don't amount to a hill of beans. What matters is, are we building, is nuclear power being integrated in a higher capacity into our power producing systems than it otherwise would be? And that's where our opportunity is. That's why, and I'm not just selling the book, but that's why I wrote the book, because we have this historic opportunity where you have these guys in charge now who are willing to break things that people weren't willing to break before. We have rather than the utilities driving demand, though demand is being driven there, you have this whole new group of tech folks and industry folks who are driving demand. And when they when they get the first request for additional information from the NRC, they're going to say, what the hell are you talking about? I can go build this. Right. So are people going to listen to them and let them go build that? Is that the change that we get within 4 years?
Well, I think that is a really important point. I understand this panel is talking about nuclear going small. But for the first time in many decades, we see demand growing and high demand. And we don't necessarily have to just build a small modular reactor that hasn't been licensed yet. Why not build a big one? We just built 2. So I get, the risk is much, much lower in that situation. We continue to do research and development and develop small modular designs, But if we have this challenge today and we need to meet it today, look at what they did in the Southeast. Keep that ball going. We built those 2 reactors at Plant Vogtle. We know how to build these. Keep the supply chain momentum going and continue to build more. And I'm a little concerned or just a little bit at a loss of why that discussion isn't happening.
Well, maybe just because of the feeling that it's been tried before, and because of the huge amount of upfront capital costs, there's a reluctance because it's a good way to lose or tie up $40 billion for a long time, right?
Yeah.
But I agree 100%. I think that we should, big nuclear solves big energy problems. Small nuclears will solve small energy problems. And so, again, I know this is a small nuclear panel, but I think of nuclear as the full spectrum of nuclear. And that's the great thing about nuclear, is that it fits in anywhere you need power at whatever size, whether you are making widgets, running a community, or a whole metropolis. Like nuclear can fit into that.
So one last question before we go to the audience. What's happening right now at the infamous 3 Mile Island? What's going on there? Is that something that plays into this discussion?
You're talking about the power purchase agreement?
I'm talking about
the recent power purchase agreement.
Isn't Mr. Gates taking an interest in that facility?
No, so I believe it's Microsoft. It's a tech company.
Well, okay, Microsoft.
Yeah. So they wanted they wanted direct access to the reliable power coming out of the nuclear plant, and they were going to pay to get it going. And the regulator stepped in and said, no, you can't take this power because people need the power. It can't just be diverted to one company for their use. And so now there are discussions around this where you have tech companies coming in. They don't want wind and solar. They need something that's reliable. That should send a message to the public.
Right.
They've done their due diligence. A lot of citizens within the United States don't understand the situation because it's complex. But nuclear power is good for all, and it's low cost.
So why was Microsoft, though, seeking that? Was 3 Mile Island, had it been decommissioned, or was it in the process of being decommissioned? It was in the process of being decommissioned. And so then Microsoft stepped up and said, hey, we would like access to that. What was it, about 2 gigawatts of power? What was it capable of producing?
Are you familiar with the stats? It's probably around one or a little more.
1, because it was an older, okay. So why were they interested in that power? What is it that Microsoft is working on that makes them so interested in a lot of power?
So this is the discussion around data centers and artificial intelligence. And in order to have computing power, it takes massive amounts of energy. And that energy can't just be there when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing. It has to be there 24/7 as needed on a continuous basis. Nuclear power does that.
And it's an indictment of the quality of the grid. That's an important part of this equation. That's why they are bringing 3 Mile Island back, and you had the Talon energy situation with Susquehanna, which wanted the direct access to it. So I would say that's less of a... It's interesting for nuclear discussions because it allows us to say nuclear is awesome, which it is. But I would say that whole dynamic is more about degradation of the grid than it is about nuclear power per se.
So, I mean, just as a quick illustration, the current iPhones or cell phones that most of you have use as much electricity in a year as does your refrigerator. Now you think, well, that's insane. How is that the case? Because when you look something up on the internet, you're not just using the energy on the phone, you are calling in energy from the data center that's generating the answer or the video, and you're also using energy to broadcast it to you, right? And so when we go to AI, when we start having AI-powered personal devices, you can multiply the energy demand on this device by at least 10, maybe more. And so imagine that all over the country. And so our power needs are going to be huge. And you're smoking something that is legal in California if you think it can be met with wind and solar. It just cannot. All right, so I think we've got Q&A time now. We have a microphone, and so here's what I need you to do. And I'm going to be ruthless about this. So let me warn you ahead of time. I will embarrass you in front of your peers. You will ask a question. You will not make a statement. Understand? Okay? Make a question. Questions generally end with a little upward inflection, right? Yeah. So, and then also tell us who you are. All right. So, right here in the first in the row with hand up, and I will move around. I won't just play favorites with the crowd.
I have to stand up?
You can do whatever you want, sir. You outrank me.
Thank you, Chuck. All right, very quick. Army's micronuclear program, originally kicked off in the 50s, supposedly, then got put to sleep, talked about in 2000, then about 3 years ago, build one that you could put on a C-17 or C-30 and fly into an austere environment. Where is that? Because that is a mini micro nuke.
So we're talking about a air portable nuclear power plant. Imagine how useful that would be not only in combat situations, but if there was a hurricane. So where is that right now? What's going on?
So I'm going to start this by saying I don't know specifically about the Army program that started back when. I know within the Department of Defense today, there is a program called PELE, P-E-L-E. And when the Department of Defense started looking at casualties at war, 50% of those casualties came from importing fuel required for diesel generators and others for electricity purposes. So they started this program to be able to secure a base for all of those necessary functions and have reliable source. So they're not tied to the local grid of wherever this base is. This program, the idea is you'd be able to put them in 1 or 2 Connex containers, which is essentially what you see on trains, and fly them in, hook them up to the other base sources required. About 5 years ago, they went out with the initial down selection. They eventually down selected the company that would build this. I believe it's BWXT with tricycle particle fuel, and they are making progress. And I am so excited for that program because what price do you put on a human life? Why are we losing 50% of our service women and men because we're bringing in fuel? And this is one example of why nuclear is so wonderful.
And I just want to, because I spend so much time saying how much I don't like government doing anything, this is a program that's really important for government to do and is the type of thing, like what Rickover did with the Navy, that when they build that, if they do it right, it can create opportunities to spin that off into commercial enterprises.
Right.
And so anyway, it's a great
All right,
program.
in the middle to the left there. Wait, Grayson, along the edge. There you go. There you go. Thank you.
Question. How did the American public initially get sold on the magic of nuclear energy?
Well, I'm certainly familiar with that. Go ahead if you...
Cool. You want to answer?
Well, you saw it with Atoms for Peace. You saw this discussion about there'll be basically infinite amount of electricity at virtually no cost. That's what they were suggesting we would have.
Cartoons that depicted it.
Right.
And it went to the children first, and they brought it to mom and dad.
There you go. Power of Hollywood. Let's go all the way over on the other side. I'm going to make, do we only have one microphone? Run, Grayson, run! No, wait, because we are live streaming this. So if you shout out, the rest of the world isn't going to hear you.
Okay, so you have us hoi polloi or interested citizens, and y'all are at a different level, and some of us have constituent voters, right? The American public. What do you think we can do, maybe with 3 practical things that will help move nuclear to where it needs to
3 practical steps.
Yeah,
to
or
move
1
nuclear.
or 2, but we want to go home and say, okay, I'm doing something about
right.
what I heard. What would those things look
Well,
like?
first of all, I think there was a book you have to buy, but
It makes a wonderful St. Patrick's Day gift if you didn't provide one for Valentine's Day, which you should have.
Are you going to answer? Or are you just going to talk about the book?
She mentioned the book. I'll talk about the book.
So what are
I'll
what are
get-
some things that we can do?
I'll give you
to-
two, other than buying the book, which is the third. One, don't be afraid of nuclear. And whenever you hear... Okay. Demand states have greater authority over regulating nuclear power. The atomic energy, and Texas is a great place to do this. Texas has already taken the NRC to court to get more authority. But the Atomic Energy Act, Section 274B, you don't need to remember that, sets forth has already expanded state authority once because states demanded it. We've had 50 years of safe operations. These new reactors are smaller, safer, and everything else. Don't rely on Washington for everything. Say, we can do it. We're Texas or wherever. That's one thing I think would be
State
a huge
action.
step forward.
It's all about communication because people are scared right now. A lot of people are scared. It's about communication. And so being able to talk about nuclear in a way that comes across to others is important. One example, we would not be here today if it weren't for nuclear power. The sun and other stars in our universe are nuclear energy. Look at the benefit of that. I think it does. I think you're right. I think it starts with our children. I think we need to amend our educational system so that we have nuclear in there. We talk about the difference between fission and fusion. And here, I'll just leave one statistic with you. The power density inside the nucleus is 1 million times or more power dense than the chemical energy that you have from the electrons that orbit the nucleus. So when we talk about coal, we talk about fossil fuels, it's one electron to another electron breaking that bond that gives you the energy. When you talk about nuclear energy, it's the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus that are either splitting or combining that create enormous amounts of power density. If you were to take an equivalent amount of energy from a nuclear plant versus wind versus solar, the nuclear plant would be the size of a small neighborhood. The wind plant would be the size of Dallas, Texas, and the solar plant would be the size of Washington, D.C. That's why power density is important if we want to conserve our land and our resources.
There you go. All right. In the middle row, one or two down, right? Keep going. Right there. Yes. Yes. There you go.
Hi, I'm Michael Hewitt from Dallas. If I heard you correctly, you said we're not enriching our own fuel anymore. We're importing it from Russia. Can you talk about how that happened and how we stopped that from happening?
So during the Cold War, Russia had a lot of enriched uranium. And when the U.S. markets started looking at how do we bring fuel into our commercial nuclear plants from a market perspective without government involvement, it was cheaper to buy down-blended uranium from Russia than it was to keep our own capabilities going. So my company, General Atomics, owns a lot of uranium ore, and our plants have been shut down because we can't compete on an open market economy. And what that did is it now made us less secure. National security went down because we are reliant upon countries like Russia to import the uranium. So since the invasion of Ukraine, the United States then started taking a policy shift toward trying to put a bunch of money back into U.S. capabilities and U.S. resources to get those plants and that capability going. I don't know what this administration is going to do.
There's another thing that happened, though, too, which was that it wasn't just market conditions. We wanted that uranium over here to get it out of their hands because the thought was we would rather have that potential bomb-making material here than sitting around over there. Because you had a lot of scientists that were out of work, and the fear was, gee, Al-Qaeda is willing to pay me $10 million for this few kilograms of uranium-235, and I'm hungry and I want to make some money.
We do produce around 25% of America's enriched uranium is produced in the United States. And a company called Urenco, it's not an American company, it's a European consortium. We have this company Centrus, which is the child company of what was the government-owned enrichment company that supplied the whole world for uranium until the early mid-80s. And in the early 90s, the U.S. Enrichment Corporation, which was the government-owned facility, was privatized, became USEC, is now Centrus, and there's a whole history that I'm not going to go into here because no one's interested, but if you are, talk to me later, I'll tell it to you. So that happened. Then you had this megatons to megawatts program. It was a 20-year program where half of our enriched uranium came from downblended Russian warheads. Great arms control program, horrible for domestic enrichers. So you can pick your poison there. When that program ended, there was a debate in the mid-2000s about how much market access Russia should have to U.S. markets. Russia was able to, the Domenici Amendment is the piece of legislation that gave Russia 20% of U.S. Market share for their cheap enriched uranium, and that's where we were when Russia invaded Ukraine. Then we put in a ban against Russian uranium, which was the right thing to do, and waivers have been given ever since that allows Russian uranium to keep coming in.
Wow.
That's what happened.
In the total back, absolute back, yeah.
Thank you. Nate Mayfield, Austin, Texas. Can you speak about the confluence of desalinization technologies and nuclear reactors?
I'll add some, and then you may add more. So in the U.S. Navy, that's where we get our water from on aircraft carriers. We suck up seawater and we distill it, and it's a great process. It's not terribly efficient and requires a lot of energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great use for nuclear power, especially if desalinization is part of a nuclear complex that's doing other things. So a friend, colleague of mine who runs a nuclear company, so I trust him, but give you that background. He claims that their reactors can do it very affordably in like a Middle East situation where there is real water constraints. So certainly it's part of that diversity that nuclear brings to the table.
Part of the challenge with desalinization is almost everywhere except for places like the Middle East, the need for it is a function of government itself limiting the availability of fresh water. And so in the case of, for example, California, which has an extensive system of water conveyance and storage that was begun to be built about 100 years ago and pretty much stopped in recent decades, Southern California wouldn't be possible without that system, right? You'd have maybe 1 million people max could live in Southern California without all the water being brought in. And so because of the artificial constraint of the amount of water that they're willing to bring in, the huge amounts of water that they dump off into the ocean for environmental purposes, then desal becomes interesting in urban environments. It's cost prohibitive still for agriculture, but urban environments are a lot more efficient per capita than our farming operations. Question over here in the front second row here. Make it good. We're getting low on time, I think.
I would like to expand a little more on the states. You talked about the NRC, and I like to think 50 states of experimental approach to address the problem of the NRC and the regulations.
Yeah, so my view is that though I'm for things, we didn't mention the Advance Act. The Advance Act is a piece of legislation that's meant to make the NRC more efficient. It's a good step in the right direction. I'm for all that stuff, making the current system work better. I don't like the current system. However, I don't believe that we should just cut the knees out from under it because no one's going to do that anyway. What I believe we should do is set up a series of alternatives. So for firms who want to take on the full financial responsibility, including insuring, liability insurance, then there should be a regulatory pathway with a very light regulatory touch, or they can go off and build those. One of those regulatory pathways, I think, should be to broaden state authority to regulate nuclear power. That doesn't mean that every state's going to have a, when I say that, people say, oh, you need 50 little baby NRC. No, I'm not saying every state needs to have an NRC. I'm saying that states that want to engage in that should be free to do so, because whether Washington politicians like it or not, they don't have magical knowledge about how nuclear power works. In fact, as we heard earlier today, the NRC doesn't know how a lot of this stuff works. So let's just let the states do it. And let's let the NRC focus on what they do, I guess, well, which is power uprates, large light water reactors, those sorts of things. So that's one thing on that. Oh, and as I said, the Atomic Energy Act has already moved in this direction. So the federal government used to have a monopoly over nuclear power. Then you had the original Atomic Energy Act that allowed commercial access to it. Soon after that, states were like, you guys are doing all this in our states. We should have some regulatory authority. So they established Section 274B, which gave states the authority to regulate some limited elements of the nuclear industry, not power production, but some other limited things. My point is, we have 50 years of safe operations. Let's expand that further. So anyway, that's the way I look at it. Setting up the alternatives that here's what I think will happen. You have the entrepreneurs taking advantage of it, making it awesome, and the old way will wither on the vine. Yeah.
All right, question here in the front row from Ernie Angelo, one of our board members. So sorry, folks, I have to take this question. Depending on the answer, it may be the penultimate question. So go ahead, Mr. Angelo.
That may not be a practical question, but I'm wondering if there's any hope of this administration being able to either do away with NEPA or make it at least somewhat practical.
One very enthusiastic clap happened from someone who knows exactly what NEPA is.
I will enthusiastically clap about that because that would be great if they did. I don't know if they will or not, but something even not more important than getting rid of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the font of much of the environmental regulatory garbage that nuclear and many things have to deal with. But a recent court decision said that NEPA didn't have the legal authority to set regulation. That might not be the exact legal language. I'm not a lawyer, but something like that, which means all of this regulation that's been promulgated out of NEPA for decades is perhaps illegitimate.
Wow.
And No. This was a specific NEPA-related thing. So NEPA claims the ability to regulate. What this court decision found was that it does not. Now, if NEPA doesn't have the legal authority to regulate, then all of that NEPA regulation, there's no enforcement mechanism. So they don't have the authority to enforce it. One of Trump's EOs built on that. So we'll see where where that ends up.
Pending. Do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, we have one last question in the very back.
Not to be rude, but I think y'all are too much into the weeds and not into reality. This gentleman over here has the answer. It was the marketing. We have been taught for the last 40 years that...
Is this a question, sir?
Yes.
Okay, it started to sound like a speech.
No, because they have to respond, because I want them to change their message. The question, he said, it's the marketing. We've been told for the last 40 years that nuclear is evil. You're going to die. Everything's wrong with it. There is nobody, including TPPF, that is marketing nuclear as a positive. We have TLR that would change the whole legal system in the state of Texas. We have this group that changed the whole school choice system in the state of Texas. How can we start a national positive media campaign as to the value and the safety of nuclear power, which is the reality of today? But not one of you all have talked about it. You get all in the weeds with all these NEPA and this and that and all these numbers.
Yes,
Nobody knows it, and they don't care.
So there's an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Nuclear Energy Institute, NEI, and I've chaired their communication committee for the last 5 years. And that is what they have focused on. And they've gone out with studies, they've gone out with surveys, they've gone out with everything that says how do we sway people's thinking around nuclear, and they've implemented communication programs behind that. So if the state of Texas wants to partner with them, they are happy to do that. They're an organization that's built up by all of the nuclear utilities and nuclear developers within the United States. And I think they're doing as good of a job as they can be doing. With more support and more activity and more communication and collaboration, they could be doing even better.
So, I mean, part of the challenge is just money. So go back a few years, Chesapeake, the natural gas company, spent between the Chesapeake and the CEO, spent somewhere around $40 million, if I remember correctly, to vilify coal because natural gas is a competitor to coal. And that's just one example. You go back to the 1960s and 70s with the anti-war movement, some of which was fomented and supported by the KGB during the Cold War. that helped turn America against nuclear power. Interestingly enough, the 3 Mile Island accident happened at the same exact time that the China Syndrome movie came out with Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda. It just happened to, just like coincidental, they came out at the same time.
Yeah, there we go. Fund a blockbuster movie.
So
That will be the number one thing. But I'm being serious.
right. So I mean,
And
that's
it's not Oppenheimer.
right, and that's part of our challenge. We live in a nation of some, what is it now, 335 million people. It takes a lot of dough to get and penetrate into the minds of the masses. And you look at all the money that was spent in the presidential campaigns, the insane amount of money that was just burned by Kamala Harris and their crew was like $1.5 billion. That's still a fraction of the amount of money that's spent to try to get you to buy drugs and underarm deodorant, right? So that we have an issue here that of scale. And yes, it takes communications, but it takes a lot of dough and very, very sophisticated communications. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending this panel.